They buried him alive, and the only soul who knew the truth couldn't speak a word. The atmosphere inside Riverside Funeral Home was heavy, soaked in quiet grief and restrained sorrow. Every chair was filled, every head slightly bowed, and every pair of eyes was fixed on the front where the flag-draped casket rested. It was supposed to be a final goodbye to a beloved chief of police, Richard Harrison, a man who had spent his life serving the city with unshakable loyalty. The air was thick with flowers and formality, the kind that cloaks real emotion in polite tradition. But all of it shattered in an instant when Max, a large German shepherd with a decorated K9 history, broke the silence with a thunderous bark. His body went rigid, muscles tensed, and his deep growls rolled out in waves that made the pews feel like they were trembling. Most people turned, startled and confused, expecting someone to restrain the dog, but he wasn't reacting out of fear or confusion. His eyes were fixed, not randomly, but directly on the coffin. Gasps rose among the mourners as Max lunged forward, his leash snapping loose from the trembling hands of the woman holding it. He ran straight down the aisle, barking louder now, barking like something was wrong, desperately wrong. His nails scraped the wooden floor as he charged the casket, knocking over flower stands and rattling the podium with his weight. People screamed. Some stood to stop him, but no one got to him in time. Max jumped, placing his front paws against the polished wood, and began barking directly at the surface, sniffing, scratching, and whining like someone was alive inside. For a moment, no one reacted. They froze in a bizarre mix of horror and disbelief. Sarah Harrison, the widow, covered her mouth with both hands, tears welling up again, but this time from something other than grief. Then a voice cut through the chaos, steady and commanding, not loud but impossible to ignore. It came from Michael Carson, a longtime detective, and the man sitting silently in the fourth pew. He stood slowly, his eyes locked on the casket, and said just one thing: "Open it." People around him turned, confused, but he didn't waver. Deputy Chief William Parker stepped forward angrily, snapping that the request was outrageous, disrespectful, and inappropriate. But Carson didn't move his gaze from the coffin. He repeated himself, "Open it." And then, almost like a whisper from behind the fog, Sarah's voice added itself to the moment. She said it too. "Do it." The funeral director hesitated, frozen in place between law and morality, but the decision had already been made. Slowly, with trembling fingers, he reached for the latches and began to unlock them. The room fell dead silent except for Max's heavy breathing. The creak of the coffin lid lifting felt louder than anything that had come before. What followed was not immediate or dramatic, but it was undeniable. Richard Harrison's chest rose slightly. His fingers twitched. His lips parted just enough to show a struggling breath trying to escape. Dr. Elizabeth Miller had already begun pushing her way through the crowd and now pressed 2 fingers to his neck. The silence fractured again when she looked up and said 2 words. "He's alive." A collective gasp rippled across the room. Someone dropped their program. A woman in the back collapsed, and Sarah, barely able to stand, dropped into a pew in shock. Carson didn't move. He stood still, watching as paramedics were called and people rushed toward the front. Max remained where he was, paw against the edge of the casket, now calm, now focused, like a soldier who had completed his mission. The truth had cracked open the ceremony and changed everything. This was no longer a goodbye. It was the beginning of a mystery. Long before Michael Carson wore the badge of a detective, before he ever testified in a courtroom or stood over a crime scene, he was just a kid no one believed in. Angry, volatile, and reckless, he had grown up bouncing between shelters, street corners, and temporary guardians who saw him more as a case file than a person. At 16, he was caught breaking into a liquor store with a group of older teens. It should have ended with him in cuffs, thrown into the juvenile system where kids like him disappeared for good. But that night, fate wore the face of Officer Richard Harrison. The man who showed up to arrest him didn't see a threat or a waste. He saw potential. Harrison didn't process him. He drove him home, and not just back to the shelter. He brought him into his own house, sat him down at the kitchen table with his wife, Sarah, and served him a plate of reheated meatloaf. That night was the first time Carson ever felt like someone saw him as more than a problem, and it changed everything. From that moment on, Harrison was more than a cop to Carson. He became a mentor, a protector, and eventually the closest thing Carson had ever known to a father. Harrison didn't coddle him. He gave him structure, rules, and a standard. He told him he could be better, then held him to it. Years later, when Carson applied to the police academy, it was Harrison's signature that sat at the bottom of his recommendation letter. And when Carson graduated, it was Harrison who pinned the badge to his chest. The two served side by side for nearly 2 decades. Through busts and raids, through funerals and fundraisers, through every high and low a cop could experience. Harrison had always been the one who remained calm under fire, the man whose moral compass never bent no matter what pressure came from the streets or from City Hall. Max, the German shepherd who now paced nervously beside Harrison's hospital bed, had been part of that legacy too. Years earlier, during a drug raid gone wrong, Max had saved 3 officers by alerting them to a tripwire. The explosion that followed left him deaf in one ear and nearly killed his handler. The department ruled him unfit for duty, but Harrison refused to let him go. He filed the paperwork to adopt Max himself and brought him home. From then on, Max wasn't just a retired K-9, he was family. Harrison took him on daily walks, trained him for civilian life, and even had a dog bed set up in his office. Sarah, who had no children of her own, embraced Max as their own in her gentle, nurturing way. Together, the Harrisons and Carson had formed a quiet, powerful bond, a chosen family held together by loyalty, respect, and an unspoken code of honor. So when Sarah called Carson in tears, saying that Harrison had died suddenly of a heart attack, Carson didn't believe it. He couldn't. Not just because it was hard to imagine the man gone, but because something felt off. Harrison had always been in good health. He exercised religiously, had regular checkups, and never ignored even minor symptoms. The story didn't add up, and Sarah herself had sounded unsure, confused even. She mentioned that Harrison had been acting differently in the last few weeks, distracted, withdrawn, like something had been weighing heavily on him. Carson attended the funeral with doubts already festering in his gut, and Max's behavior only confirmed them. When the dog began barking wildly at the coffin, it wasn't grief or confusion. It was a reaction Carson had seen before, dozens of times during active K-9 alerts. Max was trained to detect threat, blood, movement, and fear. He wasn't reacting to loss. He was reacting to something alive. And Carson, more than anyone in that room, had learned to trust that instinct. So when Max barked and clawed and refused to back down, Carson's mind was already moving towards something darker. The kind of betrayal that didn't just happen on the street, but inside the system. The kind that wore badges and shook hands at podiums. When the casket opened and Harrison took that shallow breath, Carson didn't feel surprise. He felt vindication. Someone had tried to erase the man who built this department, and they almost got away with it. The hospital room where Harrison now lay was surrounded by quiet tension. Machines beeped softly, nurses moved efficiently. Sarah sat in a chair near the window, her eyes red and hands clenched, refusing to leave his side. Max lay at the foot of the bed, unmoving but watchful, his ears occasionally twitching at unfamiliar sounds. Carson stood in the corner, back straight, mind racing. Questions swirled like smoke. Who had access to Harrison? Who would want him gone? And most importantly, why fake a death instead of finishing it cleanly? There was something bigger at play, something that went beyond jealousy, rivalry, or even revenge. And Carson knew he wouldn't rest until he uncovered it. Because this wasn't just about a man nearly murdered. It was about everything they'd built and who had tried to tear it down. It had all happened too quickly, too neatly, and felt far too much like a well-rehearsed lie. The official report claimed that Chief Richard Harrison had died of natural causes, a sudden fatal heart attack that took him in the quiet of his own home. Sarah, his wife, had been out running errands, groceries, a bouquet, a bottle of wine, and said it had been just under 45 minutes between the time she left and the moment she returned to find him slumped over on the living room couch. There was no sign of distress, no broken glass, no overturned furniture, no struggle. He looked peaceful, Too peaceful. Just Harrison, fully dressed in uniform, eyes closed, motionless, with a manila folder by his side that would later vanish before the medics even arrived. Carson received the call from Officer Jenny Ramirez, whose voice trembled as she relayed the information. She told him the paramedics had declared Harrison dead on the scene, but when Carson asked whether Dr. Miller, the medical examiner, had been called, the answer came back empty. No, she hadn't. An autopsy hadn't been scheduled. The body had been cleared for transport within the hour. No toxicology. No forensic review. Just a quiet body shuttled from home to Coffin like someone was hurrying to seal away a secret. Carson felt his jaw tighten as he listened. None of it followed protocol, especially not for a man of Harrison's rank and clean bill of health. He drove to the funeral home that same night. The air outside was crisp but carried no relief. Inside, the building was dimly lit and smelled of polished wood and carnations. Harrison's casket had already been placed in the main viewing room, dressed in ceremonial blues, the folded flag tucked perfectly beside him. At first glance, everything looked pristine, but the closer Carson got, the more things began to feel wrong. The tie was crooked, the shoes weren't his usual pair. And then there was Max. The German shepherd who had once served beside Harrison had accompanied Carson quietly, but now refused to move past the threshold of the chapel. His body went tense, his growl low and continuous, his eyes locked on the coffin like it was giving off a scent no one else could register. Sarah arrived not long after, her grief open and unfiltered. She sat beside the casket and recounted how her husband had seemed different in recent weeks, distracted, exhausted, locking his home office, sleeping in his uniform, and avoiding her gaze. He hadn't told her anything, but he had changed. Carson listened without interrupting, each detail carving deeper into his suspicion. The next day, the public viewing began. Officers from the department filled the room in rows, hats in hand, heads bowed. The mayor arrived. City officials made speeches. But something was shifting under the surface. Max, who had remained seated and silent all morning, suddenly stood. His body tensed, his nose lifted slightly, and then he barked. One sharp warning bark, then another, and another. Before anyone could react, he yanked hard against the leash and bolted toward the casket. His claws scraped against the tile as he lunged, paws slamming against the front of the coffin, barking frantically, almost violently. The room broke into confusion. Carson pushed through the crowd just as Deputy Chief Parker shouted for the dog to be removed, his voice laced with fury. But Carson saw something else in Max's behavior, something deeply familiar. It was the way the dog had always reacted on crime scenes, when something was hidden, when someone was still alive, or when danger lingered. Max wasn't grieving, he was alerting, and that meant one thing: something was still wrong. Carson stepped forward and demanded that the casket be opened. Parker snapped back, calling it inappropriate and disrespectful, but Carson didn't budge. Sarah, pale and shaking, backed him. Her voice broke slightly, but she said it clearly. "Do it." The funeral director hesitated, glancing between Parker and Carson, then stepped forward and unlatched the lid. The entire room fell silent as the lid lifted. For a moment, it was just stillness. Then Richard Harrison's chest rose slightly, catching a breath. His lips parted. A twitch in his fingers followed. And then, undeniable, he was alive. Dr. Miller, who had been standing near the back, rushed forward immediately and confirmed the impossible. He had a faint but present pulse. Paramedics were called. Sarah collapsed into a pew in shock. Max backed away from the coffin and sat down watching. Carson said nothing, but his eyes were locked on Parker, who stood frozen, mouth slightly open, face drained of all color. The man who had pushed for the rushed burial, who had overridden all procedures, who had insisted there was nothing unusual, now looked like someone who had seen a ghost rise from the box he had sealed. And Carson, standing still amidst the chaos, understood that this was never a simple death. It had been an execution interrupted. The hospital room where Chief Richard Harrison lay recovering was saturated with a tense stillness. Machines hummed softly in the background, measuring life second by second. Fluorescent lights flickered faintly, casting a sterile glow over every surface. It had been 12 hours since they pulled him out of the casket, and the chief hadn't opened his eyes since. Sarah sat at his bedside, fingers gently curled around his unmoving hand. She spoke softly, hoping her voice would reach him wherever his mind was suspended. Across the room, Max lay on the tile floor, eyes wide open, ears twitching with every distant sound. He hadn't left the chief's side, not for food, not for rest. Something in the dog's instincts wouldn't let him. Carson stood near the door, arms folded, thoughts racing through his mind like a storm he couldn't shut off. He had seen setups, cover-ups, and corruption in his career, but never anything like this. Someone had tried to bury Richard Harrison alive, and that meant this wasn't just a betrayal, it was a message. He had called Dr. Elizabeth Miller the night before, not just to verify vitals, but to ask questions neither of them wanted to. Face out loud. She had already started running blood tests, tissue samples, and a private toxicology panel, off the books, using equipment outside standard department labs. When she returned with early results, her face told the story before her mouth did. There were foreign compounds in Harrison's blood. Not toxins in the conventional sense, but something designed to suppress cardiac activity, enough to fool paramedics and simulate death. The dosage had been precise, calculated, not accidental. And based on the compound's complexity, it hadn't come from any over-the-counter source. Whoever had given it to him had medical knowledge, or access to someone who did. Carson paced the hallway outside the ICU, replaying every detail from the days before the incident. He remembered the way Parker had pushed for a fast burial, the way files from Harrison's home office had mysteriously disappeared within hours of his collapse, the way Linda, Sarah's sister, had insisted on bringing coffee every morning, slipping past suspicions with kind smiles and warm hugs. It was all beginning to converge. Pieces that hadn't fit now felt like parts of a larger pattern. And then, at 12:47 a.m., the silence was broken again, this time by Max. The dog rose suddenly to his feet and let out a low, throaty growl. Not loud, not frantic, controlled, measured. His eyes fixed on the dark hallway just outside the glass doors. Carson followed his gaze. A figure appeared at the far end of the corridor. A man in a dark coat and hat, walking slowly, hands in his pockets. He didn't move like a doctor or a nurse. He moved with purpose, with caution. When he stepped closer to the ICU entrance, Carson stepped forward. His tone was calm but unmistakably firm as he asked the man to identify himself. The figure stopped in his tracks and raised his hand slightly in a peaceful gesture, then spoke. His voice was smooth, cultured, faintly accented. He introduced himself as James Marshall, claiming to be an old friend of Richard's, someone from years ago, someone passing through town who had heard the news and simply wanted to say goodbye, though Carson didn't buy it. There was nothing casual about the man's timing, his lack of documentation, or the way Max's fur bristled in his presence. The dog moved closer to Harrison's bed, standing defensively. Marshall, unfazed, offered a business card and said he would quietly leave. He turned to walk away, but paused just before reaching the end of the corridor. Without turning back, he left one final sentence floating in the air like poison. He told Carson to tell Richard that not everyone stays buried. Then he vanished into the stairwell. Seconds later, the heart monitor inside the ICU room flatlined. Panic broke instantly. Nurses flooded the room, crash cartwheels screeching, and Sarah screamed as staff pulled her gently away from the bed. Max barked wildly, circling the IV stand. Carson rushed in as doctor. Miller arrived with her emergency kit. The fourth bag was swapped out before anyone could stop her. And there it was again, another injection site. A second puncture on Harrison's arm that hadn't been there hours earlier. Dr. Miller examined the site quickly, confirming their worst fear. Someone had tried again. Whoever James Marshall really was, he hadn't come to mourn. He had come to finish what the first dose failed to do. Harrison was resuscitated again, barely. Another round of antidotes administered, more tests ordered, tighter security put in place. Sarah stood outside the room, wrapped in a blanket, trembling. Max, bloodshot-eyed and panting, refused to rest. Carson sat in the hallway, phone to his ear, issuing orders. Ramirez was tasked with quietly pulling every security feed, visitor list, and personnel log from the hospital since Harrison had been admitted. No press, no alerts, no leaks. This wasn't a department issue anymore. It was a full-on conspiracy hiding in plain sight. When morning came, the sun bled through the blinds, casting light on the faces of 3 people who hadn't slept. Sarah stood beside her husband, quietly brushing his hair back with her fingers. Carson sat in the corner, his gun on his hip, eyes locked on the doorway. Max lay beside the bed, his chest rising slowly with every breath, watching the entrance like a guard who didn't trust anyone anymore. And with good reason, because trust, the very thing that once built this family of protectors, had nearly gotten them all killed. The moment the flat line echoed from the ICU room, a storm ignited. Nurses flooded the hallway with urgency etched across their faces. Crash carts rolled in with wheels screeching against the polished floor, and voices layered over each other in tense medical code. Inside the room, Max barked sharply, circling the IV stand with the same insistence as before. Carson was already moving. He didn't need to be told this wasn't a natural episode. As soon as he stepped in, Dr. Miller arrived with her mobile kit, already pulling on gloves and directing the staff to stand aside. She worked quickly, cutting the line and inspecting the IV bag. Then she paused, her expression shifting from focused urgency to something darker. Her fingers brushed over a second puncture, new, barely healed, but unmistakable, on Harrison's arm. She looked at Carson and said it in a low voice that didn't rise above the noise. Another injection. The second dose had been delivered just hours after the first failed attempt. It wasn't speculation anymore. Someone had tried again, this time inside the hospital under full security. Harrison's vitals began returning in slow, trembling waves. His body fought, barely, like a man treading in water deeper than his lungs could handle. Dr. Miller ordered a cocktail of counteragents and began a more invasive detox protocol, improvising with every move because the compound in his system wasn't something found in hospital handbooks. Carson stood at the edge of the chaos, his focus no longer on Harrison, but on the hallway. Whoever had done this hadn't used brute force. They had access, they had timing, and they had just walked straight into a secure medical facility, right past cameras, right past guards, and tried to kill a man already declared dead. This wasn't desperation anymore. It was methodical. Outside the room, Sarah sat against the wall with her face buried in her hands. Her tears had dried into a kind of frozen panic, one where the body no longer knew how to grieve. Carson crouched beside her, speaking calmly, asking if anyone had visited that night. She shook her head slowly, then hesitated, and mentioned that her sister Linda had dropped off tea earlier. Carson's gaze sharpened. He didn't accuse. He didn't speak. He just nodded once and stood. Across the hallway, Officer Ramirez was already checking hospital logs and accessing visitor footage. It didn't take long before she found it. A shadowy figure in a hoodie, face partially concealed, entered the ICU wing just after midnight and left 3 minutes before the flatline. The camera caught enough, a patch on the scrubs, hospital issued, but the ID tag wasn't visible. A rogue staff member? Someone on payroll? Or someone disguised? Ramirez cross-referenced the badge number of every night nurse, orderly, and lab tech on shift. One name flagged within minutes. A contract nurse who had clocked out earlier that evening, yet whose badge data showed activity hours later. When they checked her apartment, she was gone. Her car was still there, but she had vanished, leaving behind a closet of uniforms and a drawer full of burner phones. Carson stared at the evidence laid out on the table in the makeshift incident room. There was no longer doubt. Someone inside the system was still working to finish the job, and they were backed by a network smart enough to hide within shadows that wore hospital credentials and police pins. Dr. Miller returned later that afternoon with an update. Harrison was stable, again, but unconscious. They had flushed most of the toxin from his system, though his vitals remained unpredictable. She handed Carson a preliminary report with notes scribbled in the margin, pointing to a compound used decades ago in field experiments to induce near-death stasis. It was black market now, expensive, rare, and tightly controlled. You couldn't buy it at a pharmacy. You had to know people who dealt in things governments pretended didn't exist. Whoever wanted Harrison gone had access to more than local connections. This was organized, funded, precise. That night, Carson stood by the hospital window, staring out at the city Harrison had spent his life protecting. Every corner of it felt suspect now. Every shadow, every handshake, every clean report seemed like a cover for something rotten beneath. Max lay quietly on the floor beside the bed, eyes open, watching the door with the stillness of a soldier on duty. Sarah dozed fitfully in the recliner. Carson didn't sleep. He scrolled through old case files, texted trusted colleagues, and made lists of every active and cold investigation Harrison had worked on in the last 6 months. One name kept showing up, again and again: Deputy Chief Parker. The man had been at every budget meeting. He had signed off on Harrison's recent investigation requests. He had pushed the death paperwork through without Miller's verification. He had vanished the moment Harrison stirred in that coffin. Carson opened a new file and began collecting every instance Parker's name appeared where it didn't belong. Not accusations yet, just threads. But every thread tied back to the same knot. Whatever Harrison had uncovered before someone silenced him, Parker had either helped cover it or had something to lose if the truth came out. When dawn returned, the hospital remained locked down. Ramirez had posted a vetted detail of officers outside the ICU, all handpicked from names Carson personally trusted. The press had been kept away. No leaks had escaped, but it was only a matter of time. Someone had tried to kill the chief of police in broad daylight, faked his death, and nearly succeeded a second time inside the very hospital meant to protect him. The city was about to start asking questions. Carson planned to have answers, and if those answers led back to a badge, he'd follow it, no matter where it ended. The deeper Carson dug, the colder the trail seemed to get. Every document he requested from the precinct records department was either marked as inaccessible or mysteriously deleted. Harrison's last logged entries into the system were blank. Entire case files he had been actively pursuing were now showing as closed, sealed, or reassigned. It didn't make sense, not unless someone had gone through after the incident and scrubbed it all clean. But whoever had tried to erase Harrison's digital footprint hadn't counted on one thing. Carson had trained under the man for over a decade. He knew how Harrison organized his notes, which systems he didn't trust, and where he kept backups when he felt something was too sensitive for the department server. That instinct led Carson to the basement of Harrison's house, where a locked filing cabinet sat hidden behind an old water heater. Inside were dozens of handwritten pages, scribbled names, timelines, even maps of old narcotics distribution routes. And right at the center of it all was a red folder labeled in Harrison's careful handwriting, Kingfisher. The name didn't ring any bells in the system, but the way it was circled, underlined, and starred told Carson everything he needed to know. It wasn't a person, it was a code name, a node, a spider in the middle of a web Harrison had been mapping piece by piece, off the books, without alerting the very department he was supposed to trust. Pages referenced high-ranking officials, shell companies, fake IDs, off-site properties, and offshore accounts. But the trail ended abruptly 2 weeks before his collapse. There were no more entries after that date, no follow-up, just silence. That's when Carson realized Harrison had stopped writing the day he got too close. Back at the hospital, Max remained stationed beside Harrison's bed, like a permanent guardian. The dog had only left the room for bathroom breaks, always returning with urgency, tail stiff, body tense. Carson knew animals like Max didn't operate on coincidence. Their senses were hardwired for threat detection. That night, Carson decided to test a theory. He stepped into Harrison's room with an article of clothing belonging to Parker, an old uniform jacket borrowed from the department's archive storage for inspection purposes. Max, who had been dozing, snapped alert. His ears shot up and his nose twitched. Carson brought the fabric closer. The reaction was instant. Max growled. Not loud, not staged, but the same low, deep vibration he had given off in the funeral home. Carson removed the jacket immediately. There was no doubt now. The dog wasn't reacting to memory. He was responding to scent. Something specific, something associated with danger. Something that made Carson's suspicions about Parker sharpen into certainty. Meanwhile, Ramirez uncovered a new lead from Harrison's encrypted laptop backup drive, which she had managed to access after 3 failed password attempts. The drive contained a single audio file, low quality, but intact. In it, Harrison's voice was calm but heavy. He mentioned receiving anonymous threats after a city council vote. He spoke of corruption that extended beyond the department, into real estate deals, council members, campaign donors, and even the mayor's office. He said he feared Parker had been compromised and that someone was funding large-scale suppression operations under the guise of community revitalization. Harrison had planned to meet with an FBI contact the following week to hand over evidence. That meeting never happened. Carson took the file straight to Ramirez and Dr. Miller, who both sat in stunned silence as they listened. The implications were enormous. If this information went public, it could topple multiple political careers. It would turn the city upside down. But that's exactly why Harrison had kept it hidden, because he didn't know who to trust. And now that trust had become a currency more dangerous than any badge. Later that night, Carson returned to Harrison's hospital room. The chief's condition remained critical but stable. Machines still beeped, and IV lines still pulsed quietly under the low light. Sarah had gone home for the night under gentle protest. Carson sat beside the bed, not as a detective this time, but as a man who had been raised by the one lying in front of him. He spoke softly, not expecting a response but needing to say the words. He told Harrison he had found the file, that he was getting closer, that Max had already figured it out, and they were listening now. Carson's voice cracked once, but he pushed through. He promised Harrison that if he woke up, the story would already be in motion. The truth wouldn't stay buried. And while he spoke, Max remained curled at the chief's feet, ears twitching at every shift in hallway footsteps. He hadn't moved since Carson returned with the evidence. It was almost as if the dog understood what was coming. The fight wasn't over. The enemy was still out there. But now they had a name, Kingfisher. And Max, more than anyone, had already smelled the truth. The hospital had grown quieter than usual that night. Most of the staff had already rotated off shift, leaving behind the graveyard crew, overworked, half awake, and often too used to silence to be alarmed by it. The halls were dim, the corners shadowed, and the faint rhythm of machines humming behind ICU doors echoed like heartbeats across tile. Carson sat just outside Harrison's room, arms crossed over his chest, his body aching from long hours and a constant state of alert. The weight of everything he'd uncovered so far hung heavy on his shoulders, but his eyes remained sharp. Beside him, Max lay curled up but wide-eyed, watching everything. The dog hadn't let his guard down since the second injection attempt, and Carson trusted him more than any badge in that building. It was just past midnight when the rhythm shifted. Max sat up without a sound, nose twitching toward the hallway at the far end. Carson noticed immediately. He leaned forward, following Max's gaze toward a stretch of corridor shrouded in low light. A figure emerged from the darkness, walking at a deliberate pace. He was dressed well, too well. Not in scrubs, not in the casual dress of a night visitor, but in an expensive coat, tailored slacks, and leather shoes that didn't make a sound on the floor. His hands were in his pockets, and his posture was calm, calculated, not hesitant like someone who'd lost a friend, but confident, like someone checking that a job had been finished properly. Carson stood slowly, letting his hand rest on the grip of his sidearm. As the figure approached, he called out with authority, asking him to identify himself. The man didn't stop immediately, but slowed his steps before raising his hands halfway in a gesture of peace. He offered a gentle, almost apologetic smile and introduced himself as James Marshall. He claimed to be an old acquaintance of Harrison's, someone who had served with him years ago, who had heard about the tragedy and wanted to stop by discreetly. No disruptions, no headlines, just a moment to say goodbye to a man he once respected. The explanation was smooth, almost rehearsed. Marshall's voice carried a foreign lilt, refined and deliberate. His eyes wandered just enough to study the entrance of the ICU room without drawing attention to it. But Carson saw the flicker of calculation. Max let out a low growl, the sound barely audible but unmistakable in its intent. The dog's body stiffened, and his stance shifted slightly, moving in front of Harrison's door like a sentinel guarding a vault. Marshall didn't flinch at the dog's reaction. He kept his calm smile and reached into his coat pocket, not for a weapon, but for a business card, which he extended toward Carson with a kind of performative courtesy. Carson didn't reach for it. Marshall continued his gentle tone, saying he understood the timing wasn't ideal, that he didn't want to impose, and that he would leave if necessary. He said it all with the perfect amount of regret in his voice, like a man who was just trying to pay respects, though Carson didn't believe a word of it. Nothing about the man's presence felt right. His timing was too perfect, his demeanor too polished, and Max's response was the final proof. Dogs didn't care about courtesy or charm. They reacted to intent. Marshall turned to leave, nodding respectfully as he took a few steps back down the hallway. But then he stopped, just before reaching the end. Without turning around, he spoke again, his voice lower this time, more deliberate. He said Carson should tell Richard that not everyone stays buried. Then he disappeared down the stairwell, vanishing into the dark just as silently as he'd arrived. Carson didn't hesitate. He turned and rushed back into Harrison's room. Max followed instantly, barking with agitation, moving toward the IV line. The machines were still beeping, the vitals still stable, for now. Dr. Miller was called in immediately, woken from her on-call cot down the hall. She arrived within minutes, snapping on gloves and inspecting the line. Her face changed the moment she examined the injection site. Another puncture, new, fresh. Whoever James Marshall really was, he hadn't come to pay respects. He had come to deliver the final dose. Carson's hands shook slightly as he helped Dr. Miller swap out the IV. She moved quickly, administering the antidote while barking instructions to nurses who didn't yet understand the gravity of what had just occurred. Max stood between them and the doorway, alert and on edge. Harrison's vitals had dropped slightly, but not catastrophically. They had intervened in time, again. But Carson knew there wouldn't be a third chance. If Marshall got close again, if another hand reached for the wrong needle, it would be over. Outside, the hospital security team reviewed camera footage and found nothing. The man had avoided every major angle, moved through side corridors, and exited through an emergency stairwell with a stolen badge that hadn't pinged the system. His prints, if any, were likely wiped. His name, if real, wouldn't be found in any database. But Carson didn't need a file to know what he was dealing with. Marshall wasn't just a stranger or a hired hand. He was the cleaner, the finisher, the one they sent when everyone else had failed. In the early hours of the morning, Carson sat beside Harrison again, watching the machines level back out. Max lay on the floor, eyes half closed but still awake, still listening. Sarah had returned after being called, now sitting silently in a corner, wrapped in a blanket and staring at her husband like she was afraid to blink. Carson leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes locked on the door. No words, no sleep, no assumptions, only preparation. Because they all understood now that someone hadn't just tried to kill Harrison once. They had tried twice, and they wouldn't stop until he was truly, finally, and permanently gone. The hospital no longer felt like a place of healing. It felt like a battlefield frozen in time, where every hallway carried whispers and every door might conceal the next move in a quiet war no one had publicly admitted was happening. After the second attempt on Harrison's life, security had been doubled, then tripled. Not by the hospital administration, but by Carson and Ramirez personally. They didn't trust the standard channels anymore. Too many names had gone silent. Too many logs had been edited. Too many favors were being called in from people who didn't want their fingerprints anywhere near the chaos. Carson took over the night watch himself, parking a chair beside Harrison's door and staying awake while others tried to rest in the nearby waiting room. Max refused to leave the foot of the bed, and his presence had become more than symbolic. It was tactical. The dog was the first warning sign. Always had been. The official narrative still hadn't changed. The press hadn't been notified that Harrison was alive. The public still believed their police chief had died of natural causes. And Carson knew that was exactly how the people behind this wanted it. The more time passed, the harder it would be to explain. The story would get buried under bureaucracy, the trail would go cold, and the case would dissolve into speculation. But Carson had seen this kind of cover-up before. Quiet, calculated, and carried out by people who never pulled the trigger themselves. The real killers didn't use bullets. They used signatures. They used silence. He made a decision that morning before the sun came up. They couldn't play defense anymore. Waiting for the next attempt would be another mistake. They needed to move. They needed to draw someone out. Carson pulled Ramirez into the break room, both of them exhausted but focused. He laid out what they had: Marshall's visit, the scrubbed camera footage, the altered badge entry, the unknown compound used in both injection attempts, the sealed case files, and the red folder labeled Kingfisher. Every piece was circumstantial, but together they formed a picture that couldn't be ignored. Ramirez agreed, but she also warned him. If they went after this too loudly, it wouldn't just be enemies who tried to stop them, it would be allies, the kind that had more to lose than to gain from the truth. Still, Carson wasn't backing down. He called in 2 retired officers Harrison had trusted in the past, men no longer tied to the department, men whose pensions made them immune to current pressure. He gave them copies of everything, encrypted and hidden across 3 separate drives, with instructions that if anything happened to him, they would leak it directly to the press. Insurance. Not because he was afraid, but because he wasn't naive. Later that day, Dr. Miller reported new lab results. The compound used in the second injection wasn't just rare, it was untraceable in standard toxicology. The only reason she caught it was because she'd already been looking for it. She told Carson that whatever organization had access to this kind of chemical precision wasn't just street-level dirty, it was military-grade, black market or government adjacent. This wasn't some bitter cop with a grudge. It was bigger, deeper, coordinated. Carson took the update back to Harrison's room, standing quietly for a long moment before speaking. Sarah was asleep again, curled in the corner chair, her exhaustion now visible in every crease of her face. Max raised his head when Carson entered but didn't move. The dog had barely eaten. He was watching everything, always. Carson leaned against the wall and began to speak, not loud, not for anyone but Harrison to hear. He told him what they had learned, about the red folder, about Marshall, about Kingfisher, about the name that kept circling back into every side report, every off-the-books transaction, every sudden personnel shift. And that's when Harrison moved. It was slight, just the fingers on his right hand, a twitch, then another. Carson stepped forward, watching closely as Harrison's eyelids fluttered. For the first time in days, the man stirred. His breathing remained measured, shallow, but it was conscious now. A fight was beginning beneath the surface. Carson called for Dr. Miller, who entered immediately and began checking vitals, speaking softly as she examined him. Harrison didn't wake fully, but he didn't retreat either. His hand tightened slightly, gripping the bedsheet. It was the first real sign they'd had that the man beneath the wires and monitors was still fighting to come back. Carson didn't leave the room for the next 2 hours. He just sat there waiting, staring at the man who had built the foundation of the department, the man who had saved him when he was nothing more than a stray kid with no future. Now the roles had reversed. Harrison was the one who needed protection, and Carson was the one drawing a line in the sand, daring anyone to try and cross it again. Outside the room, Max eventually lay back down, but his eyes didn't close. He stayed like that well into the night, ears perked, nose twitching at every sound in the hallway. Because like Carson, he knew the fight wasn't over. It was only the beginning. By morning, the weight of what was happening could no longer be contained in whispers. Too many people inside the hospital had seen too much. A chief who had been declared dead was now under armed guard. A dog had twice sounded the alarm before the machines did. And 2 unexplained incidents had required emergency medical intervention in the span of 48 hours. Carson knew it was only a matter of time before someone leaked something, whether by accident or pressure, and he couldn't afford a single misstep now. He had Max posted inside the ICU, Ramirez filtering communication logs from the department, and Sarah shielded from all press inquiries, which had started coming in despite the silence they had tried to maintain. The Internal Affairs Division had gone quiet, which was suspicious in itself. Normally, an officer in Harrison's condition would have been met with formal inquiry, but now there was nothing. No calls, no emails, not even a courtesy report. It was too clean, too coordinated. Carson had been in the game long enough to know that silence was never safety. It was a prelude to erasure, If someone higher up wanted this story to die, they were already working on burying it before it could breathe. He needed a plan that didn't rely on permission. Ramirez returned mid-morning with news that one of the lab technicians working the night shift, the one logged for running the initial IV bags, had left town. Not transferred, not reassigned, vanished. The last security footage showed him entering a car with tinted windows, license plate removed. Carson wasn't surprised. It only proved what he suspected. Someone had resources, coordination, and motive. It wasn't one person acting alone. It was a system protecting itself. He started assembling timelines, overlapping Harrison's last few weeks with the city council's closed-door sessions. A pattern emerged. Every meeting Harrison had pushed back on, every vote he opposed, linked back to a development project that had passed under Parker's oversight. Then, as if the pieces were waiting to fall into place, Carson received a text from a number he didn't recognize. It only said, he kept one more copy. Check the locker. At first, Carson assumed it was a trap, but something in the phrasing echoed Harrison's method. Brief, deliberate, like a note scribbled in the middle of a mission. Ramirez traced the number. It was bounced through multiple servers, untraceable, but the message was specific. It referenced a precinct gym locker, one Harrison had used regularly years ago before transferring to the Central Division. That afternoon, Carson drove alone to the old station. The building had been renovated, but the lockers remained mostly untouched. He found the one matching Harrison's old number. Inside, beneath a pair of unused boots and an Academy sweatshirt, was a sealed envelope and a small digital recorder. The envelope held a map, 4 bank account numbers, and a list of names. Some Carson recognized, others he didn't. The voice on the recorder was Harrison's. Calm, steady, recorded like he knew it might be found too late. He spoke about a single name, Kingfisher, said it wasn't just a person, it was a code name for an operation that extended beyond the city, into county funding, law enforcement budgets, even judicial elections. Carson stood in that empty locker room with the recording playing on a loop, the realization pressing down harder with each passing second. This wasn't just about a hit job or political revenge. It was about control of departments, budgets, districts, and people. The plan hadn't been to kill Harrison out of spite. It had been strategic. Removing him was part of something bigger, something still in motion. He left the building quietly, the recorder in his pocket, the map tucked deep into his coat. Back at the hospital, Harrison hadn't moved, but his vitals had stabilized. Sarah remained beside him, Max curled under the bed. Carson entered without a word and took his place in the chair. He placed the recorder on the table and whispered to the man in the bed that the message had been received. He didn't know who had tipped him off, but he knew why they had, because even the people inside the machine sometimes wanted to watch it burn. The tension had shifted, not disappeared, just changed into something more watchful, more patient. Harrison remained unconscious, but his presence felt different, more present somehow. The way his breathing matched the slow pulse of machines, the way his fingers twitched every now and then, and the subtle movement beneath his closed eyes all hinted that something within him was trying to return. Sarah noticed first. She had been holding his hand all morning, talking about old moments, like the time he knocked the gutter off the roof while trying to hang a backyard swing. She swore she felt his fingers respond. Not tightly, not fully, but enough to make her look up and call for Carson. He didn't dismiss it. He didn't need to see it himself. After everything they had lived through, he trusted instinct more than any screen. Dr. Miller reviewed the monitors and agreed there had been a small improvement. His vitals were stronger. Brain activity was rising. She explained the signs carefully, not promising anything but acknowledging the shift. Carson understood what that meant. It wasn't just medical progress. Harrison was fighting back. But even that progress came with risk. If anyone outside this room found out that the man they had tried to bury was waking up, the next attack wouldn't come through a drip or syringe. It would be faster. Final. They had to move before word leaked. They didn't have time for safety anymore. Ramirez came in quietly, holding a small folder. She had been combing through old complaints Harrison had filed. Most had disappeared into bureaucratic black holes, but one stood out. A confidential envelope addressed directly to the city attorney, filed 3 months ago and marked eyes only. Inside, Harrison laid out a pattern of falsified grants hidden under fast-track development permits. The trail linked back to Parker, who had signed the approvals without review. And once again, campaign donations circled back to the same small group of political donors. It was cleaner than any criminal cover-up, because it had all been done on paper, with stamps and letterheads. Carson felt the noose tighten. The motive was no longer theory. It was documented. Still, it wasn't enough to move publicly. Not yet. Then Harrison's monitor beeped differently. Not in warning, just change. Carson turned as doctor. Miller stepped back from the bed. Harrison's eyes began to open, slowly, unfocused but present. Sarah covered her mouth and whispered his name. For a few seconds, there was only silence. Then Harrison blinked, his eyes flicking between the faces in the room. His voice was faint, his throat too dry to speak, but he was awake. He had crossed back over. Carson waited. He didn't push. He simply leaned forward and quietly asked the question that had been burning in his chest for days. "Who did this to you?" Harrison didn't answer immediately. His lips parted, but no sound came. Then, after several tries, a single name formed, a whisper, barely audible, but clear. He said, "Wilson." Not Parker, not someone already under suspicion. It was County Commissioner Henry Wilson, the same man who had spoken at Harrison's funeral, the man who stood beside Sarah and praised her strength, the one who donated to the department's foundation, who shook hands with grieving officers, who smiled at press conferences and signed grants in Harrison's name. Carson processed it silently. The picture began to reassemble in his mind. Wilson hadn't just been connected. He had orchestrated it. It explained the reach, the coordination, the precision of the silencing attempt. Parker had just been a tool. The real hand pulling the strings had been smiling during the burial. Carson didn't say anything out loud. He stood, walked to the door, and started planning the next move. It took Carson a full hour before he said Wilson's name out loud. He sat in the break room alone. Lights dimmed, Max curled under the table nearby, and stared at the list of names in the red folder again. Wilson wasn't mentioned, not directly, but Carson had learned how to read between the lines. Shell companies linked to Wilson's old law firm. Bank accounts tied to campaigns he had once managed. Subcontractors from city construction deals that matched the permit fraud Ramirez had uncovered. It was all there, scattered, never explicit, but always circling the same man. Wilson had never been in uniform, never worked a beat, never answered a dispatch. But he had power, the kind of power that never wore a badge because it didn't need to. He had access to every city budget, every judicial appointment, and enough media influence to rewrite reality by the time it hit the evening news. The realization brought a weight with it, not just because of who Wilson was, but because of how much worse it made everything. This wasn't just an attack from within, it was a betrayal from above. Harrison hadn't been targeted because he was a threat to someone on the street. He had been targeted because he got too close to a man whose whole operation depended on staying invisible. And for Wilson to take such a risk, to fake a death, inject a compound, manipulate paperwork, it meant Harrison had found something that could blow the entire machine apart. Carson couldn't move yet, not openly. They still didn't have a direct link, only implications, whispers, and a half-conscious name spoken in a hospital room. But he didn't need Wilson's confession to know what needed to happen next. He had to draw him out. Ramirez returned later that evening with a subtle nod, her face telling him everything he needed to know. She had spoken to an FBI contact, someone Harrison had trusted from a joint task force years ago. The agent, Daniels, was in town for another investigation, but agreed to meet discreetly. Carson didn't tell Sarah. He didn't tell anyone outside the circle. If Wilson had this much reach, even a single overheard word could compromise them. The meeting took place in the parking garage beneath the courthouse, late at night, where shadows swallowed voices and the only witnesses were security cameras Carson knew had blind spots. Daniels listened carefully, his expression tight and unreadable, as Carson laid everything out. Harrison's near death, the altered IV lines, the missing files, the sealed complaints, and finally the whispered name. The agent didn't look surprised. He just asked how far Carson was willing to go. Carson didn't hesitate. He said as far as it took. Daniels gave a nod that felt more like a warning than agreement, then slid a small envelope across the hood of Carson's car. Inside was a warrant draft, blank still, unsigned, but ready. Daniels would move if they could get one piece of concrete evidence connecting Wilson directly to the attempt on Harrison's life. The opportunity came the next morning. Ramirez found a flagged transaction buried deep in one of the frozen accounts Harrison had mapped in his hidden locker file. It was a consulting payment listed as a strategic infrastructure fee, paid to a company that had been dissolved 4 years ago. The date matched the week Harrison had submitted his sealed complaint. The amount, though buried in coded transactions, led back to a slush fund housed under a community redevelopment initiative, an initiative created by Wilson's office. It wasn't enough for conviction, but it was enough to rattle a man who had built his career on untouchable perfection. Carson drafted a message. No threats, no accusations, just a whisper, leaked quietly through a mutual contact in City Hall. He made sure it reached Wilson's desk by noon. It simply said, "The chief is awake." They waited. The moment the message reached Wilson, Carson felt the shift without needing confirmation. It wasn't in the form of sirens or a phone call. It was the sudden uptick in subtle movement. Department heads began quietly rescheduling meetings. A judge Carson had tried calling earlier that week suddenly became unavailable. 2 city council members removed their social media pages. It was all quiet, polished, discreet. But in Carson's world, silence this loud meant only one thing. Someone powerful had just been rattled. Wilson had built a career on being measured, invisible behind layers of plausible deniability. But now that the man he thought was buried was awake and could potentially speak, those layers were peeling away. Back at the hospital, Harrison's recovery continued slowly. He drifted in and out of sleep, still groggy, still weak, but with enough clarity now to recognize Sarah when she leaned in and whispered to him. His voice hadn't returned to full strength, but his eyes were alert. He followed conversations with faint nods, blinked in response, and gripped Sarah's hand with the determination of someone unwilling to slip back into silence. Max rarely moved from his place near the foot of the bed. His head remained on his paws, ears twitching whenever. Footsteps passed too close to the room. He had become more than just a companion. He was a line of defense Carson trusted more than any uniform. Ramirez kept close watch on communications coming from city offices. She had set up a trace for any movement linked to Wilson's known contacts, and by early afternoon, something unusual surfaced. A call had been placed from Wilson's personal cell to a private law firm known for managing crisis containment. The conversation was short, encrypted, and bounced through 2 anonymous numbers. But the timing was telling. It happened less than an hour after Carson's anonymous message had been delivered. That was enough for Carson to act. He reached out to Agent Daniels and relayed what they had. The pieces were in motion now. Wilson knew Harrison was alive, and he was already trying to manage it. That evening, Carson sat with Harrison again. The hospital room was dim except for the glow of machines and a single bedside lamp. Sarah had finally allowed herself to go home for a few hours of sleep. It had taken convincing, but she knew she couldn't hold herself upright for much longer. Carson remained by Harrison's side, reading aloud from the reports they had gathered. He didn't expect responses, but it wasn't about that. It was about making sure Harrison knew they hadn't stopped, that the plan to silence him had failed, and that they weren't waiting anymore. They were moving. As the night deepened, footsteps echoed outside the hallway. Not fast, not loud, just enough to catch attention. Max lifted his head and let out a low, soft growl. Carson stood, stepped into the hallway, and met the eyes of a man standing 10 feet away, holding a bouquet of flowers and a look too clean to be genuine. It was Henry Wilson. He smiled as though the last week hadn't happened, as though the city wasn't boiling under the surface. He stepped forward and said he had come to check on an old friend. Carson didn't move. He didn't blink. He simply asked what Wilson really wanted. Wilson's smile held, but his eyes darkened slightly. He said he wanted peace, that now wasn't the time for rumors or dramatics, that the department needed unity, not division. Carson nodded slowly, thanked him for the visit, and watched him place the flowers at the nurse's station before turning to leave. The entire interaction lasted less than 2 minutes, but Carson understood what it was. It wasn't a courtesy call, it was a warning, a reminder that power doesn't always announce itself with threats. Sometimes it comes bearing flowers and soft smiles. But beneath the surface, it's still a blade. After Wilson's quiet hospital visit, Carson didn't speak for several minutes. He remained by the window in the hallway, watching the man's polished shoes disappear into the elevator. Everything about the visit had been staged, from the expensive flower arrangement, white lilies, clean and formal, to the carefully timed delivery. It was all a show of grace, masking the weight of a veiled threat. Carson had encountered men like Wilson before. They didn't pull triggers, they didn't raise voices, but their fingerprints could be found on the consequences of silence, of erased files, of lives quietly rearranged. Wilson hadn't come to wish Harrison well. He had come to send a message. He still had reach, and he wasn't afraid to use it. Back in the ICU, Max had refused to relax the entire time Wilson was present. The dog had stood, body tense, eyes locked on the commissioner like he recognized the stench of manipulation. Once Wilson left, Max let out a deep exhale and returned to his spot by the bed, as if he too understood the theater that had just played out. Harrison stirred briefly, murmuring incoherent words, but the stress hadn't triggered a setback. Dr. Miller noted it as progress, however minor. The only setback, Carson thought, was knowing their enemy had now made eye contact. Carson met Ramirez later that afternoon at the precinct parking lot, where they spoke away from cameras and offices. She confirmed Wilson had arranged a private dinner that same night with 2 council members, both of whom had been referenced in Harrison's locker files as connected to project grant approvals. It wasn't a coincidence. Carson suspected damage control. Maybe Wilson was preparing a legal wall, or maybe he was preparing for a fallback plan in case Carson pushed forward publicly. Either way, they had to move now, before the next act of political theater turned into something irreversible. Agent Daniels joined them later that evening, this time without a formal request. He had seen enough from the evidence packet Carson sent earlier that week to move without hesitation. The bank transactions, the Scrub City audits, the toxicology report, all pointed toward a coordinated effort to remove Harrison under the radar. What they still didn't have was a direct line between Wilson and the attack itself. Carson proposed a trap, not one built with weapons, but with information. He would let slip that Harrison had regained memory, that he had recorded names, that the audio would be released if anything happened again. Not as a threat, but as a lifeline, forcing their opponents to act while they were being watched. They crafted a message carefully, just vague enough to raise alarm, just believable enough to reach the right ears. Daniels ensured it reached a mid-level staffer in Wilson's office. Carson gave no interviews. There were no press leaks, just a single conversation overheard in a hallway about a chief who was getting ready to speak. Then they waited. That night, the hospital's security team doubled in size. This time, they weren't department volunteers. Daniels had called in federal agents, plainclothes and quiet, stationed on every floor without explanation. Ramirez remained nearby, checking every shift log personally. Carson didn't sleep. He stayed in the chair across from Harrison's bed, the red folder open on his lap, Max at his feet. Sarah, too exhausted to stay awake, rested her head beside Harrison's arm. It was the first time she had slept without jolting up in fear. At 3:26 a.m., Max stood, not suddenly, not loudly, but with complete purpose. His ears perked, his nose turned toward the hallway. Carson looked up just as the nurse at the station received a call and left her post. 2 silhouettes passed the camera blind spot near the stairwell. Daniels, watching from the security hub, radioed immediately. The 2 men were dressed as orderlies. Neither had clearance. Neither had identification. The trap had worked, and now the response was in motion. The first man reached for the ICU door with gloved hands, moving with the practiced silence of someone who had done this before. His partner stood watch behind him, scanning the hallway quickly, unaware that 3 federal agents had already taken positions just out of their line of sight. Carson watched from the corner of the hospital security room, headset on, eyes fixed to the grainy live feed. Daniels was beside him, calm, focused, speaking softly into the radio, coordinating the response with surgical timing. This wasn't a confrontation born of chaos. It was precision, a trap laid carefully and sprung exactly when the enemy thought the room was empty. Inside the ICU, Max had already moved to the front of Harrison's bed. His stance was low but ready, tail still, body poised. The second the imposters breached the door, Max growled, low, sharp, controlled. The sound froze the lead man just long enough for Daniels to give the signal. Agents converged from both ends of the hallway, shouting commands, weapons drawn but not fired. The suspects turned to run but barely made it 3 steps before they were taken to the ground. No injuries, no crossfire, just clean containment. The hallway lit up with harsh commands and the rustle of bodies hitting tile. Carson didn't rush into the scene. He waited until the men were in cuffs, masks removed, IDs checked, none of which were real. One of them had a faded tattoo partially covered by a bandage on his forearm. Daniels noted it immediately and had it photographed. It matched a known symbol used by a private security group dissolved years ago for illegal activity in overseas operations. These weren't amateurs, they were specialists, contracted ghosts, the kind of men used when official channels didn't exist. In the interrogation room, both suspects refused to speak. Their silence wasn't stubborn, it was trained. No questions, no reactions, no names. But they carried tools, a syringe kit, a small vial of the same synthetic compound found in Harrison's blood, and a USB drive with internal schematics of the hospital's staff areas. There was no way to deny intent now. It was an assassination attempt, carried out under the cover of night, targeting a man who had already survived being buried once. Daniels escalated the case immediately. No more quiet containment, no more waiting. With physical evidence in hand, a federal warrant was drafted and approved by sunrise. Carson knew the time for games had ended. Wilson had sent these men, directly or through layers, didn't matter anymore. The chain of evidence was closing, and the next step was confrontation. The agents began collecting statements, freezing assets tied to shell companies, pulling security footage from Wilson's properties. Carson returned to the hospital and checked on Harrison, who had remained stable during the entire incident. Dr. Miller adjusted his sedation level slightly, noting increased brain activity despite the night's events. Sarah didn't ask for details. She didn't need to. She saw the look on Carson's face and simply held her husband's hand tighter. Later that day, Wilson made a public appearance at a city development press event. He wore his usual charm, spoke of progress and unity, and shook hands with investors. But Carson was already there, standing at the edge of the crowd. Watching the man give a speech about transparency while knowing what had just happened hours earlier. The performance didn't surprise him. What surprised him was how calm Wilson still looked, as if none of it mattered, as if he believed the storm wouldn't touch him. But the storm had already arrived. Wilson just didn't realize yet that the cameras were about to turn. The air in the precinct was heavier than usual that morning. Word of the hospital breach had already traveled through unofficial channels, though no one said it out loud. Officers who had once offered nods of indifference now looked at Carson with sharpened curiosity. They didn't ask questions, but their silence, their glance toward the television monitors, their hesitation in the hallway, it all said the same thing. Something big was coming. Carson didn't bother correcting them. They weren't wrong. The city had been sleepwalking for years under a surface that looked polished and professional. Now that surface was cracking, and everyone could feel it. Inside the temporary federal command room Daniels had set up on the second floor, things moved faster. Walls were covered in maps, timelines, screenshots, and financial flowcharts that traced back through nearly 6 years of seemingly disconnected transactions. At the center of the wall stood a printed photo of Henry Wilson. Under it, names, corporate affiliations, and shell companies now frozen under the new warrant. Every hour brought in another piece of the puzzle, an assistant district attorney who quietly withdrew from office 3 months after receiving a campaign donation. A zoning commissioner whose office was funded by a grant directly tied to a community program that didn't exist. The structure Wilson had built wasn't just complex, it was deliberate, not a conspiracy of chaos, but one of design. Still, the one thing they didn't have yet was the link Carson needed most: recorded intent. Something undeniable. something that would hold up even if Wilson's entire legal team tried to bury it under procedure. That's when Ramirez handed him a small jump drive. She had gone through Harrison's backup laptop again, scanning temporary files the original team hadn't fully decrypted. What she found was a voice memo, short, corrupted at the edges, but salvageable. Harrison had recorded it the night before his collapse. In it, his voice was tired but focused. He spoke not in paranoia, but in certainty. He said he feared Wilson had learned about the red folder, that someone had accessed his personal hard copy files. And then he said something chilling, that if anything happened to him, the only copy of the full evidence would be gone unless someone looked for the locker. Carson listened to the recording in silence. Harrison hadn't just prepared for exposure, he had predicted it, not because he saw the future, but because he understood exactly how the system worked. Good men weren't silenced in a storm. They were made to vanish quietly with just enough paperwork to make their absence look like retirement, and Harrison had refused to let that happen without leaving a trail. The evidence was enough to schedule a formal hearing. Daniels began working with a federal judge, sealing the investigation until the case could be presented in full. Carson, meanwhile, returned to the hospital once again. This time, he walked in with everything: the memo, the warrant, the transcripts. Sarah met him at the door. Her eyes were tired, but steady. Harrison was awake again, still weak, still barely able to speak, but aware. He blinked slowly as Carson sat beside him and explained what was coming. He told him the names, the companies, the warrants, and he told him about Wilson's visit. Harrison didn't flinch. He didn't react in anger or fear. He simply looked at Carson for a long moment and gave the smallest nod of approval. Carson had always been the student, but now in that quiet room, Harrison didn't look at him like someone he'd once saved. He looked at him like someone he trusted to finish what he'd started. Carson stood, gave Max a quiet pat behind the ears, and stepped back into the hallway. There was one more visit he had to make before the hearing, because Wilson didn't know that the real trap wasn't the failed assassins or the frozen bank accounts. It was Harrison, alive, awake, and about to speak. Carson didn't wear his badge when he walked into the marble lobby of the county administration building. He didn't need it. He wasn't there to make an arrest or ask questions. He was there because Wilson still believed he had the upper hand, and Carson needed to look him in the eye one more time before that illusion shattered. The security guard at the front desk recognized him and gave a slow, hesitant nod, unsure whether to stand, salute, or step aside. Carson didn't acknowledge him. He just kept walking. Wilson's office was at the top floor, hidden behind a door with no nameplate, just a discreet buzzer. Carson pressed it once. A soft chime rang inside. A moment later, the door opened and Wilson himself stood there. Sleeves rolled, tie loosened, looking more like a consultant than the man who held half the city's strings in his hands. He smiled as though they were old colleagues meeting by accident. He didn't look surprised. He invited Carson in without asking why he had come. The office was sleek and modern, glass walls, clean lines, expensive furniture that made no noise when touched. Carson didn't sit. He stood near the window, watching the city below them. For a moment, neither man spoke. The silence held weight. Wilson finally broke it by offering coffee. Carson declined. Then he turned, looked the commissioner in the eye, and asked why. Not about the money, not about the politics. Just the why of it all. Why Harrison? Why the erasure? Why the danger? Wilson didn't answer right away. When he did, it was with a calm that felt almost theatrical. He said Harrison had become inconvenient. Too many questions, too many files, too many connections. He had stopped playing the game. And men like that, Wilson explained, didn't last long. He didn't admit to anything. He didn't use direct language. But every sentence was layered with implication. It was the kind of conversation you could never quote in court, but would never forget. Carson said nothing for most of it. He let Wilson talk, let him deliver his version of the truth, a polished speech designed to justify betrayal as strategy. And when he was done, Carson handed him a sealed envelope. Inside was a printed copy of the federal warrant. No warning, no commentary, just the facts. Wilson's expression didn't change. He looked at the paper as if it were a memo about city planning, then set it calmly on his desk. Carson turned to leave, but paused at the door. He told Wilson that Harrison was awake, that he remembered everything, that his testimony had already been recorded. He didn't wait for a reaction. He didn't need one. The door closed behind him with a soft click, but the echo it left in the room was deafening. Back at the hospital, Daniels confirmed the hearing was scheduled for the following morning. Harrison's presence would be private, conducted under secure video link. The hospital wing was now fully secured by federal officers. No visitors were allowed. Even Sarah was required to check in with clearance. Carson returned late that night, walking the corridor like a man rehearsing his closing argument. Max followed quietly, step for step, like he understood that tomorrow wasn't just about justice, it was about finishing something that had nearly cost them everything. Inside the ICU, Harrison was still awake. He didn't speak, but when Carson sat beside him and placed a hand on the edge of the bed, the chief nodded once more. That was all the approval he needed. The courtroom wasn't in a courthouse. It was a federal holding facility, chosen not for spectacle, but for security. The hearing was closed to the public, with only essential legal personnel, 2 federal agents, and a judge presiding. Carson sat near the back, not as a participant, but as the one who had carried the truth on his back through every silent corridor and sleepless night. He didn't need to speak. His job was already done. The truth was in motion now, and the man who had nearly been erased was finally going to be heard. Harrison's video feed blinked to life on the mounted screen at the front of the room. He looked thin, drained, but steady. His voice was quiet, but clear. His eyes didn't shift. He spoke directly, with the gravity of a man who had waited too long to say what needed to be said. He didn't dramatize it. He simply told the truth about the permits, the ghost accounts, the silenced audits, and the pressure. About how questions turned into warnings, and warnings turned into threats. And finally, how his work had led him to a name, Wilson, and how everything had changed after that. He described the night he began feeling sick, the moment he suspected his coffee had been tampered with. He recalled how files vanished from his home and how he had begun to suspect even the people around him. He explained the backup plan, the locker, the red folder, and why he had recorded the voice memo, because he no longer trusted the system to protect him. The room remained silent throughout, the kind of silence that only truth can create. No one interrupted, no one questioned. It was too complete, too clean, and too damning. When the recording ended, the judge called for a recess. Daniels turned to Carson and gave a quiet nod. The testimony had been more than enough to issue indictments. Wilson was no longer protected by title or political insulation. His signature appeared too many times on too many documents, linked to too many decisions now tied to a failed assassination attempt. And the 2 operatives from the hospital incident had finally spoken, both striking a deal in exchange for immunity. They had named their employer. It was over. Wilson was arrested within the hour. No press, no statement. Just a clean extraction from his downtown office by federal agents in suits who didn't speak to anyone as they guided him into the black vehicle. Carson received the update by text. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He just looked at the message, then at Harrison's still image on the paused video screen. The truth had lived, and for the first time in weeks, it no longer needed to hide. Later that evening, back at the hospital, the quiet returned. Max finally curled up and slept, his breathing steady for the first time in days. Sarah sat beside Harrison and told him softly that it was done, that the man who had tried to bury him now stood behind bars. Harrison didn't say anything in return. He just exhaled, long and slow, and closed his eyes, not from exhaustion, but peace. The war had been fought, not with weapons, but with will, and the man who had been left for dead had become the voice that exposed everything. Carson left the room after midnight, walked down the empty corridor, and stepped outside into the cold night air. He didn't need the badge on his chest to know what he had done. He had kept a promise, and that was enough. The city didn't erupt. It didn't panic. There were no protests, no sirens, no sweeping announcements. When the news of Henry Wilson's arrest broke, it came not with fire, but with calculation. Headlines spoke of ongoing investigations, using vague language crafted to shield legacies. Press conferences were filled with rehearsed statements and clipped denials. But the people who mattered, the ones who had been watching from the outside, understood. They had seen this play out before, only never with a name that high or a fall that steep. Carson watched it unfold from a distance. He stayed out of the spotlight. Daniels had offered him a chance to speak, to be the one who explained the investigation, but Carson declined. This wasn't about attention. It was about closure, about finishing something that had nearly finished them. He spent his mornings at the hospital checking on Harrison, reviewing recovery notes with Dr. Miller, listening to Sarah read articles aloud that now hinted at audits, resignations, and shifting alliances. Harrison remained stable, still recovering, still quiet. But something in his posture had changed. He wasn't just surviving, he was returning. Max, too, had changed. The dog had become something of a quiet hero. Nurses greeted him when he passed. Officers brought him treats. His story had started to spread, about the funeral, about the bark, about the instinct that had saved a life. People admired the animal without needing the full details. Carson let the story exist as it was. The legend was true enough, and Max, for his part, never acted different. He still slept beneath Harrison's bed, still stared at the door like a guardian, still perked up whenever new footsteps echoed from the hallway. The department, meanwhile, had entered a strange in-between. Deputy Chief Parker had resigned without a fight. His public statement claimed exhaustion. No one pushed further. Internal Affairs had begun a quiet review of city-linked grants, this time with federal oversight. Several officers had been placed on administrative leave. Whispers floated through the station, but Carson didn't engage. He knew it would take time. Systems don't collapse overnight. They fracture slowly and only rebuild when someone forces accountability into the cracks. One evening, Carson sat across from Daniels at a quiet bar not far from the courthouse. Neither of them spoke about the case directly. It was safer that way. But Daniels raised a glass and said that not many stories like this ended with the victim still breathing. Not many dogs made national headlines. Not many cities got a second chance. Carson didn't toast. He just nodded and sipped once before placing the glass back down. For him, it wasn't over. It was just quiet for now. The hardest part was knowing what to do after the storm. Carson had spent weeks moving from emergency to emergency, from room to room, tracing names and secrets through hallways most people never entered. Now there was stillness, the kind that made his skin itch. He spent more time at the station, reviewing unsolved cases, mentoring newer officers, but something still hung in the back of his mind. Unfinished. That's when Sarah approached him outside Harrison's room. She didn't say much, just asked what he planned to do next. He didn't answer. Not immediately, because for the first time in his career, the next step wasn't obvious. Carson didn't go to the precinct the next morning. For the first time in weeks, he left his phone behind, laced up a pair of old boots, and walked the path behind Harrison's neighborhood. The one that looped past the trees, the edge of the river, and the half-broken bench where he and the chief used to sit years ago. The weather had turned cold again, but the sky was clear. He didn't think about Wilson. He didn't think about politics or files or testimonies. He just walked, trying to remember what silence without danger felt like. He had been a different man when Harrison pulled him off the street all those years ago. Not innocent, just untethered. The badge hadn't made him whole. It was Harrison's belief in him that had. The steady guidance, the quiet lessons, the days where a man with 30 years of service made time for a kid who no one else trusted. That was the foundation Carson had built his life on. And now, after everything they'd survived, he couldn't help but wonder if Harrison knew just how much it had mattered. He returned to the hospital before noon. Harrison was awake, alert, sipping water slowly through a straw, while Sarah adjusted his blanket. Dr. Miller had confirmed that his cognitive strength was returning faster than expected. His voice was rough but usable. He could answer basic questions, recognize people, even joke when the mood struck. Carson entered the room quietly, but Harrison saw him right away and motioned for him to sit. They didn't talk about Wilson, not directly. Harrison didn't ask for updates. Carson didn't give details. Instead, they talked about the department, about Ramirez, about Max, who lay asleep near the window with the sunlight pooling across his back. Harrison asked if the coffee at the precinct was still terrible. Carson smirked and said nothing had changed. There were pauses, but none of them felt empty. Carson told him about the day Max barked at the casket, how the room froze, how people looked at the dog like he'd gone mad. He told him about Parker's expression when the truth cracked open and how Daniels had stepped in without waiting for permission. Harrison listened without interrupting. When Carson finished, the chief simply said, "I knew you'd carry it." It wasn't praise, it was acknowledgement, a passing of weight from one man to another. They sat for a while after that, the soft beeping of the monitors the only sound between them. Sarah had stepped out to take a call, and Max continued dozing in the sun. Carson leaned back, arms crossed, and asked the question that had followed him through every hour since it began. Why hadn't Harrison told him? Why hadn't he said what was happening before it reached this point? Harrison didn't answer right away. His voice was still strained, each word carefully chosen. Eventually, he said it wasn't about trust. It was about protection. He didn't want Carson dragged down with him, didn't want the past he had saved him from to become the reason he got swallowed in the present. Carson didn't reply. He understood, even if it still stung. Before he left, Carson reached down and scratched Max gently behind the ear. The dog blinked once, then let out a soft exhale, tail tapping once against the wall. Carson looked back at Harrison, nodded, and said he'd be around. No big words, no dramatic goodbye. Just the kind of parting two men shared when everything that needed to be said had already lived between them. Weeks passed. The storm quieted, not because everything had healed, but because the noise had finally run out of places to echo. Henry Wilson remained in custody, awaiting trial. The city murmured about reform and internal reviews. New committees were formed. The media cycled through its headlines, then moved on to something louder. But inside the walls of the Riverside precinct and the corners of that hospital wing, the people who had lived the truth knew what had really happened. The real victory wasn't about courtrooms or statements. It was about survival, about the man who had returned from the edge and the quiet force that carried him back. Harrison was moved out of ICU and into a recovery suite. His steps were slow, his speech still uneven, but every day showed progress. Max followed him through the halls now, not as a guard, but as a shadow. Close, loyal, patient. Nurses smiled when they passed. Officers nodded when they visited. For a man who had been nearly buried under a false death certificate, Harrison now looked more alive than the system that tried to erase him. Carson returned to the precinct gradually. No welcome party, no speeches, just back to the desk, the paperwork, the rhythm. He didn't chase new cases right away. Instead, he trained. He took younger officers under his wing, the way Harrison once had. He watched for quiet warnings others missed. He walked the halls like a man who had learned that battles don't always arrive with fanfare. They unfold in silence, in red folders and forgotten evidence, in coffee that doesn't taste quite right. He carried that knowledge like armor. One morning, Sarah invited him to Harrison's home. It was the first time he'd been back there since the night the chief had almost died. The house looked the same. The kitchen still smelled like old wood and strong coffee. Harrison was sitting outside, wrapped in a blanket, watching the sky as Max lay beside him on the porch. Carson joined him without ceremony. They didn't talk about what had happened. They talked about the department, about the dog, about things that still needed fixing. That was Harrison's way. Never linger in the wreckage. Always face forward. As the sun dipped lower, Harrison reached down and patted Max once. The dog shifted closer, placing his head gently against the chief's leg. Carson stood and looked out at the yard, remembering all the nights he'd stood there years ago, wondering if he could ever earn the trust he'd been given. Now he knew the answer. Before he left, Harrison looked up and said something simple. "You kept your promise." Carson didn't respond with words. He just gave a short nod, turned back toward the street, and walked to his car. He didn't feel like a hero. He didn't need to. The truth had been saved. A justice had begun. And somewhere along the way, a boy who once didn't belong anywhere had become the man who made sure no one else would be forgotten. One step at a time, Carson drove into the quiet, knowing the next call, the next case, the next moment would come, and when it did, he'd be ready.